Well, I'm looking forward to sort of connecting around this theme tonight of something very nuanced and something that I teach in many of my classes at HDS in counseling and chaplaincy and end of life work, which is how do we balance these two qualities of compassion and non attachment. This is something that students often ask. This is a life practice. You don't have to be a chaplain or sort of training in any way for caregiving. Um, and as I was sort of meditating on this earlier today, it really struck me on a more deeper level how this practice can actually expand awareness as well. How do we do that? Well, if we're, or rather, how does this work? In my experience, and I can only speak from that here, um, attending to these two qualities simultaneously within the sensory body of compassion and non attachment, within the body, um, presence and a sense of wholeness can arise when we're holding these two qualities at once. And it's a natural thing. It may take a little practice, but often when we are cultivating what we might call sort of a multiple attention or attention on more than just one focus, but we're more open, we're more sort of sensing um, maybe two or more different experiences at once, such as we can feel the stillness of the body, but also feel the movement of the breathing. It's really quite simple in a way. What happens when we are cognizant of that process of holding, say, stillness in the body and movement of breathing at the same time is that awareness tends to just open a little bit more. That there is this quality of mindful openness that opens a little bit more because we are having to expand to hold these two things. And for our purposes, the practice we'll be doing later is called strong back, soft front. Some of you have done this before with me. It's a practice that is has been sort of clarified, not necessarily invented, but clarified by the great Roshi Joan Halifax, who is a Zen teacher. She is the founder of Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, where I've done some training on a couple of occasions and have led workshops with colleagues there. So um, this is it's a lovely practice that brings this balance into the body itself as a mindfulness exercise or as a mindfulness practice. And here, as I'll explain in a little while, we root the sort of the practice of non-attachment. Ultimately, the way Roshi Joan talks about it is equanimity, which is an outcome of non-attachment in the spine. That the spine represents this quality of stability, steadiness, evenness, non-judgment, basically embodying a presence, and the softness of the belly of love, of gentleness, of compassion. So this practice, strong back, soft front, really helps us to bring both of these qualities simultaneously into our mindfulness practice. It's a really lovely way to think about how to integrate these two dimensions that are both so important and that need each other. So, so non-attachment. This is a strange term. It's a very strange term, and it puts a lot of pressure on us, I think, especially when we are suffering and when we have anxiety and fear. And it doesn't mean, non-attachment doesn't mean that we just don't feel anything. So often there can be this kind of misunderstanding. Does non-attachment mean that I am just totally unfeeling and can't love things, can't have passion? No, this is not what it means. It just is more of a recognition that whatever we are clinging to is just subject to change. And so we hold on lightly. We hold on lightly. And yet we do hold on. We do hold on. Steadiness, non reaction, non judgment, all of these are interrelated. And yet we are going to react because we're humans. Yeah, we can't always be in non-judgment. So then how do we cultivate in our mindfulness practice with ourselves this quality of equanimity, if that's true? How then does the equanimity lead us to stillness? And how does stillness really bring us into a place of ease where compassion can open naturally? And we're not putting so much pressure on ourselves to try to make ourselves more compassionate or bring energy into the compassionate work we're doing, especially if we're depleted or through our work and so on. And on the other side of this apparent polarity, compassion, connection in the midst of suffering, an openness of heart, a deep engagement in the midst of that non-attachment, a spaciousness, and all of which leads to a sense of wisdom. Yeah. And compassion, I think, is always relational. It's always relational, whether it's relating to ourselves or others or situations or life or the cosmos even. And so checking in to this relational element, we may feel a lot of feelings. We may have empathy, which is not the same as compassion, not from a Buddhist standpoint. Empathy in this case is more feeling the feelings of another or even our own feelings through the feeling sense, through the heart's feeling sense. That's one way, anyway, to define empathy. And it's extremely useful, especially if we're counselors or listening to a family member who is struggling. We sort of use feelings as a way to understand. And this is where empathy can lead to what we call empathetic distress or empathic distress, where we're overloaded by being in the presence of suffering. This is a problem more so of the feeling overload. Compassion, however, is more so of this quality of understanding the suffering of another person, not just feeling it through our feeling senses, but we see it, we unify through it, we understand it, and we're not going to flee from it. We're willing to stand in the midst of it. This teaches us kind of the wisdom that is possible in suffering through compassion because we recognize the helplessness when either we or others are really in suffering and they can't just snap their fingers and change. Yeah. So there is this attending to someone who is helpless within their suffering. We feel the empathy, yes, but the compassion is there to soften and open and unify. We basically are unifying with them. And again, compassion isn't the problem, I think, if we feel depleted in that encounter. It's empathy. It's what we bring into compassion that is uh, sometimes depleting. It's all the issues, the fear, the striving to be helpful when we don't know how, and so on. And I'll give you an example. There was a young woman when I was a chaplain at Dana-Farber. She was 25 when she was diagnosed with acute leukemia and was given 2 weeks to live without radical treatment. And of course, she agreed to do the treatment. She had just started learning about Buddhism. She said, "Is there a Buddhist chaplain here?" And the nurses called me. Um, and we can fast forward if you're concerned about her. She's a lovely young woman. She is actually thriving to this day. This was in 2017. She is a journalist. She lives in the UK. She's married, has a puppy, a new puppy. At the time, it was dicey. Her body was beaten up with full body radiation. She had gone through a bone marrow transplant, um, chemotherapy, just about all the treatments they were throwing at it. And one day, she, who had been an incredibly resilient young woman, positive, and just ready to take this challenge on, really wanting to learn about Buddhism and about meditation. How can I how can I ease the suffering of the woman in the next room because she cries out all night in pain? I want to do something for her. Just really an amazing response to her situation. And one day, I met with her in a consult space, and she was utterly defeated. She was sobbing. She was depressed. She was, and I say depressed in quotes, for those of you who are clinicians. Um, she she was done, essentially, and she said through tears, "Chris, what do you say to someone like me?" And usually I have an answer for everything. I can be rather wordy, as some of you already know. I was utterly, there was nothing that I could say. I sat there helpless and sharing the helplessness she was feeling. And what I did in that moment was um, just drop right into my heart and open it even more than it had already been. I opened it wide and I allowed my compassion to hold both of us in that sense of helplessness. It was the only response that I could make was just to practice this and to remain engaged with her, not check out, not back away, not to go into my head and think of the perfect response. There was no response. So I sat there and then radiated the light of my love out into the space around both of us. Now, in order to do that, I really needed to have some stability. And so in the midst of that, I felt my sit bones on the chair. I felt my butt really firmly planted rather than seeking to streak off into some other place. I remained there. I was in my body as I was practicing this. And so for me, I mean, that was an important example of how can I practice this in those rare occasions where there is nothing to say. um, it was important to hold the tears with her and not say anything. Um, I don't know if she felt it. I never asked her, although we did write an article together years later about the experience, about just the overall experience of her being a patient and me being a chaplain. And that encounter was something that we did write about. But it's an example, yeah? It's an example of this capacity of trying to remain integrated and whole in the midst of something that otherwise can fragment the different parts of who we are. Um, Non-attachment isn't not feeling the experience, yeah, but it's having a choice, I think, in how to respond in a deeper way, in a way that is authentic and genuine. So when we think of non-attachment as that which is not feeling, we're basically getting it wrong. Yeah, we can love deeply, and yet through non-attachment, through this strange quality that we're talking about, we can love more freely when there's no agenda, no expectations for outcomes. So it doesn't mean we don't have expectations of the ones we love. I don't mean that. Um, we all need to be held accountable in our relationships for best practices in the love that we share. But it's really more of kind of that anxious clinging, that projection onto the other person, anxious clinging, and then the reactivity that arises because of what we're carrying, because of our part of it. This is what non attachment is speaking to, our own anguish, our own neediness, our own kind of projections. And so, in this way, the steadiness of the spine, as we practice the strong back, soft front, the steadiness of the spine teaches us how to be non reactive and just allow the waves of distractions and thoughts and reactions to just come and go. We're not trying to get rid of any of it. We're just trying to hold it with some stability and an evenness of mind. Yeah. Seeing good things, bad things, neutral things as equal energy. It's just mental energy or physical, sensory energy that comes and goes. All of it is passing, fairly fleeting. Um, so this is where equanimity abides. This quality that we find in the Indriya Bhavana Sutra in Buddhism, where the Buddha says, peacefulness, stillness, and equanimity is like the drop of a water on the leaf of a lotus. As it lands, it rolls away. It's not stopping the rain. It's just allowing the water to drop and roll away. This is what then leads to a sense of easefulness, where compassion can feel safe and it can feel open, where the connection remains. The openness of heart remains, but we are stable in the midst of it, where engagement and connection is alive and awake, and ultimately where uh, spaciousness is possible. As Lama Shang, the great sort of Tibetan master, says, the ultimate mind that we cultivate within the heart is like a treasury of space. The ultimate mind that we cultivate within the heart is like a treasury of space. It is like refining gold and getting to a place where the light that we see gold reflecting becomes the heart. So, how does meditation help with this? How can we practice this? And this is where strong back and soft front, I think, in a very simple, very accessible way, allows for presence. It's just a simplicity of presence and awareness to arise naturally when everything is quiet. Um, and in that way, we can kind of move past the fear of touching another person who is suffering. We can see that person beneath the level of their suffering and continue to see the potential they carry for goodness, the good heart, for wisdom on their end. And then we learn the suffering is impermanent. Thankfully, this young woman I mentioned, she did so well with the treatment. The bone marrow transplant took. Over time, she recovered and is thriving. We can't always see where that leads, but we also don't want to get stuck in projecting futures that are just out of the realm of a dream or our anxieties. So we remain fully in the moment with what arises. And so, in this way, last thing I'll say for now is that non attachment, or rather equanimity, and compassion need each other. Without equanimity, the empathy of compassion can be overwhelming. We can get sort of drowned almost in the suffering we encounter. And so equanimity keeps us stable and even. And without compassion, equanimity devolves into indifference, into apathy, avoidance. We may feel strong, but we're not engaged. We're not connected. And so these two qualities really are two sides of one coin. They are very much mutually reliant. We need the strength and the stability, and we need the softness and the openness of unconditional love.